Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking Volume 3 of a truly fascinating text called The Catalyst of Impermanence. We are about to decode some of the most profound spiritual questions humanity has ever asked, but we're going to do it using the strict, load-bearing mathematics of thermodynamics, information theory, and quantum mechanics. It's a brilliantly mind-bending synthesis of the eternal and the finite, and I am absolutely thrilled to explore it with you today.
Okay, let's dive right into this. The entire text hinges on this central, staggering paradox. Think about it for a second. If our ultimate destination as spiritual beings is absolute peace and eternal joy, why must our journey lead through a valley of profound sorrow, constraint, and suffering? Like, why not just start at the finish line? The text offers this incredibly poetic thesis right off the bat. But over the next few minutes, we're going to explore how the data suggests this beautiful sentiment isn't just some stretched-out metaphor meant to make us feel better about hard times. We're going to see how this is actually governed by the deepest laws of physics. So here's our roadmap for this physics of the soul explainer. First, the problem of perfection. 2, free will and friction. 3, the thermodynamics of grace. 4, the quantum physics of compassion. And finally, returning to the infinite. We have a highly structured, logical path ahead, so let's get started.
Section 1. The problem of perfection. The absolute equilibrium of eternity. We begin with the baseline problem, which is grounded in the second law of thermodynamics. In an isolated system, things move toward absolute equilibrium. But experiential equilibrium is just static perfection. Meaning, if you only ever breathe oxygen, you don't even know you're breathing. If you exist in a state where you only ever experience unbroken love and bliss, it loses its weight. It just becomes an indistinguishable, unnoticeable hum in the background.
Now, what's really interesting here is the math behind that hum. In information theory, there's a concept called Shannon entropy. If a signal is perfectly uniform and unvarying, like an eternal state of unbroken bliss, it carries mathematically zero discriminable information. Just zero. Therefore, mortality is the necessary entropy introduced into the system to actually activate our comprehension. Without the chaos of mortality, the bliss literally registers as nothing.
There's this principle called the Weber-Fechner law of psychophysics, and it demonstrates that human perception only responds to ratios of change. At zero contrast, the curve of comprehension just sits dead at zero. It flatlines. This proves that mortality supplies the crucial contrast. You absolutely need the dip, the change, the variation, for our souls to be able to feel or comprehend anything at all.
Section 2. Free will and friction. The illusion of riskless agency. That brings us to our second point, the variables of human existence and free will. If we were placed in a safely padded simulation that prevented us from ever making a mistake, or causing harm, or failing, are we truly free?
Well, in information theory, we actually call that padded room riskless agency. And mathematically, if the outcome is completely independent of the action, meaning you end up safe no matter what you do, your choices transmit zero information into the world. Your will is causally void. Meaningful agency requires the real, terrifying, high-wire risk of a bad outcome. Without the possibility of failure, choice is just an illusion.
So, good and evil must exist in a symbiosis. Think of Ohm's law in a battery. A battery needs both a positive and a negative terminal to generate a current. Now, unless you're an actual battery, you probably don't enjoy the feeling of resistance. But evil provides the essential friction. If there's no innate pull towards selfishness, what Carl Jung called the shadow or the natural man, there's no potential difference. And without that potential difference, the current of moral action simply drops to zero. You have to have resistance to generate power.
Section 3. The thermodynamics of grace, Maxwell's demon, and the atonement. But all this raises a massive question. If mortality introduces the entropy of sin, and decay, and failure, how do we avoid being entirely destroyed by it? We need a filter. We essentially need the spiritual equivalent of Maxwell's demon.
This is where Landauer's principle comes in. It shows us that erasing information, like the stain of a sin or a terrible mistake, actually requires physical energy. You cannot reduce your own spiritual entropy in an isolated system. The ledger just won't balance. Grace is the external energy source that absorbs that cost. It allows us to selectively filter our experiences. We get to keep the hard-won wisdom of our failures, while an external source pays the heavy thermodynamic cost to erase the spiritual decay. Section 4. Quantum physics of compassion. The entanglement of shared suffering. Okay, we have to shift our focus to the collateral damage of mortality. Why are we placed in a system where the evil actions of one person are allowed to cause immense, unfair suffering to a totally innocent person?
Why do we have shared pain?
And quantum mechanics brilliantly illustrates the answer here. Think about a separable state. That's like two isolated souls just sitting side by side, completely independent. But then contrast that with an entangled Bell state. In an entangled state, the particles are so deeply linked that what is certain of the pair as a whole is irreducibly uncertain for either one alone. Their reality is completely, inextricably woven together.
The equations suggest that an isolated soul actually has an irreducible incompleteness. If you were a lone sufferer in an isolated simulation, you could certainly learn personal resilience, for sure, but you could never, ever learn compassion. Compassion is the off-diagonal coherence of the joint state. It is only through the quantum entanglement of shared, vulnerable, collateral suffering that we learn true compassion.
Now, some might see a philosophical flaw here, right? Thinking, does this math somehow justify evil? But we use the math of constrained optimization to completely defeat that idea. We do not encourage or justify evil. Rather, evil acts as a mathematical constraint that shapes the optimal path to virtue. A heavyweight in a gym isn't there to crush you. It's there to provide the boundary you push against to build muscle. Evil does its necessary work only when we push against it and completely reject it. And why must that suffering be so heartbreakingly visceral? Well, for an eternal being with an infinite baseline of existence, a minor inconvenience wouldn't even register. A tiny blip of pain just vanishes against the backdrop of eternity. The depth of the sorrow traversed strictly bounds the height of the comprehensible joy. You literally cannot build a high mountain without carving out a deep valley.
Section 5. Returning to the infinite, the integral of contrast. This brings us to our final realization. We haven't fallen from grace. We are merely stepping willingly into the darkness, for a brief moment, so we can gather the heavy contrast necessary to finally, truly see the light. Comprehension isn't just some static state you arrive at, it's an accumulation. It is the mathematical integral of all the hard-won contrast a soul has lived, the ascents, the descents, the sharp drops. That accumulated area under the curve is exactly what is carried undiminished back into the timeless realm. Which leaves us with this powerful physical metaphor of a phase transition. Carmen does not become a diamond through gentleness. It requires a brutally rigorous environment to reorganize its structure into something luminous and something permanent. It takes extreme mathematical conditions to make this happen. Immense pressure, searing heat. But the crucial takeaway is that this pressure is not the enemy of the diamond. The pressure is its literal author. Without it, the transformation is physically impossible. I want to end on this lingering thought from the text. It challenges us to look at our own mortal friction, our daily struggles, and our deepest suffering not as a punishment or some mistake in the universe, but as the rigorous, essential physics required to build an eternal soul. What you're going through is just the math of becoming a diamond. So ask yourself, if the universe is willing to apply this much pressure to forge your soul, what exactly is eternity preparing you for? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep pushing against the resistance, and I'll see you next time.